viewers here, and welcome back to Kyle is Famous.
Kyle
We
woke up.
already know this,
He-
so let's move on to the fun part.
Kyle. Kyle decided to take some time to choose the perfect outfit, knowing Kyle was unsure. After much, Kyle wrote down his Kyle wrote down his last. Kyle quickly crouched.
I wonder what ending
Kyle
we
started
can
to
get
pick.
this time.
Soon he had a. Kyle threw back his. Kyle firmly pressed his ear. I heard Rachel May is going on a trip out of the country soon. Oh, girlfriend, tell me more. Well, what I will tell you is that every night I don a mask that looks like a bug and fight misdoers. There was a stunned silence. Then a door opened, and someone exited the neighbor's apartment.
Well, we already did this ending.
Kyle approached his downstairs neighbor's door and knocked. Kyle hurried to the set. Sitting across from his host chair was a glamorous woman with an air of genuinity. As Kyle approached her, Rachel looked up and smiled. Good evening, Kyle, she said, looking him in the eyes. I've been looking forward to being here. Kyle responded.
We gotta do this again.
Kyle stretched his arms wide, tilted his neck upwards, and was interrupted by his producer telling him and Rachel that it was time to start the show. A moment after seating, the studio lights brightened and the cameras clicked on. Good evening, everyone, said Kyle, looking at the camera. Welcome back to Stay Up Late with Kyle. Kyle vomited all of the horrible things he had eaten earlier onto the floor. Rachel looked at Kyle, concerned, gave a couple coughs, and decided to play it cool and keep the show running. Kyle stopped, then vomited again, then continued with a shaky voice. Tonight, I have the pleasure of interviewing the lovely Rachel May, who needs no more introduction. Kyle motioned to Rachel, who smiled and waved at the camera. Hello, Kyle, she said. I'm glad to be here. Well, I'm sure we'll have a lot to discuss. So we might as well dive right in, said Kyle. I'm very ready, said Rachel with a winning smile. Kyle produced the notes he had taken earlier. You've been involved in a lot of different things, said Kyle, but what's your funniest story? Well, that's a great question, Kyle, said Rachel. I think the story I always remember is the first time I tried to make dinner for my family. In the soup I made, I swapped out the water with milk and tipped the whole jar of salt in the pot. While my family was sick from trying to eat it, I swiped their things and locked myself in my room. Rachel laughed elegantly. Kyle decided to move on. Kyle asked another question. So, said Kyle, my mother is a mother. My mother's mother is her mother and my mother's mother. And many mothers have mother's mother's mother. Is your mother a mother? Rachel went to answer and stopped. I believe, she said eventually, that I should answer yes?
This seems to be
Kyle
going
asked
well.
another question. We all have one. What's your guilty pleasure? Ooh, well, that's an easy answer, said Rachel, dipping pickles in chocolate sauce. It might sound strange, but it's tangy and sweet at the same time. I eat it far too often. Rachel smiled sweetly. Kyle asked another question. A burning question from the fans, said Kyle. Beef, do you prefer it mashed or blended? Rachel answered promptly, mashed, and no more was said on that matter. After reading his final question, Kyle looked up from his paper. "Well, Rachel," he said, "I think that's all I was planning on asking you." "If that's the case, Kyle, may I ask you something in return?" asked Rachel, smiling one more time. "Why exactly did you decide to wear a suit of armor today?" Before Kyle could answer, the camera shut down. The broadcast was over. Kyle returned home knowing the interview had gone well.
Awesome. We did
But as he
good.
lay in bed and drifted to sleep, he felt that perhaps something was still missing. Kyle decided to stay put and wither away. Kyle withered successfully and died. Kyle is now a ghost. This does not relieve him of his responsibilities. Kyle knelt down and inspected the old, rusty container that had been in his closet for ages. It was locked, but had a blade-shaped slot in the top.
That's new.
Kyle decided to take some time to Kyle quickly crouched down. Kyle began to comb through the damp piles of filth and mold on his floor in search of helpful items. After finding and eating a few bits of crumbs and old cheese, Kyle found something much more important.
I think we might still need to eat.
Indeed, it was the corpse of Harry, a friend that had gone missing years ago while at Kyle's house. Kyle was glad to see him again, but was unsure of whether to interrupt such an important day with Harry business. Kyle hoisted Harry onto his shoulder and took him outside. Kyle began dragging Harry's body down the street, drawing many, many stairs.
This is probably disturbing.
Kyle
to
knew
the
exactly
others.
where he needed to take Harry's corpse, on a lovely playdate, just the two of them. Kyle and Harry started at the arcade. Kyle used Harry's arms to operate the joysticks and push buttons. After 5 or 6 different games, the two friends had enough tickets for a single candy bar. They took their prize to the local park for eating. Kyle tried to feed some of the chocolate bar to Harry, but Harry seemed to not have an appetite. After eating, Kyle noticed a nearby playground. He dragged Harry over. Kyle tried to figure out a way to swing Harry onto the swing set, but, lacking the ability to grip, Harry kept falling out. Instead, Kyle started to lug Harry to the top of the slide and shove him down time and time again. Finally, Kyle took Harry to the movies to see as many popular films as their pocket change allowed. Kyle quickly found that he had no pocket change, so he searched through Harry's pockets until he found his wallet. Kyle bought 2 tickets to A Love Romance. After getting inside, Kyle left Harry to go find a restroom.
So they were just
By the
fine
time
letting a
Kyle
dead
had finished
body
using the
inside?
restroom, he had forgotten that he brought Harry along. Kyle watched A Love Romance by himself. Harry's corpse sat on a bench in the atrium. While Kyle was in the movie, a beautiful thing happened. Harry's corpse, imbued with the power of friendship and love, was reanimated. Harry's old, rotten flesh gained color and life. His fingernails regrew. His missing eye came back. By the time the movie was over, Harry was able to greet Kyle with a large, friendly hug as his old self. Kyle was confused but delighted to have his long-lost friend meet him on his way out of the theater. The two made plans to get drinks together and parted ways for the day. Kyle returned home, forgetting about the interview with Rachel.
This is crazy.
Kyle decided to take some time to choose the
What do I need a CD for?
Kyle wrote down his first question. Kyle wrote down his second question. Kyle wrote down his third question. Kyle wrote down his last question. Kyle ripped his page of notes out of the notebook and...
Time to make some breakfast.
Kyle opened the fridge, intending to find something to eat. Kyle constructed a breakfast of poached eggs and toast, along with a small fruit cup and grilled sausage. Kyle ate his breakfast slowly and thoughtfully, enjoying every bite. He felt refreshed.
Yummy.
Kyle approached his downstairs neighbor's door and knocked. A middle-aged woman named Gabby answered the door. Kyle unhinged his jaw and swallowed Gabby whole.
I can't believe this is possible.
Job done, Kyle returned to the middle of the street. Kyle hurried to the set. Sitting across from his host chair was a glamorous woman with an air of genuinity. As Kyle approached her, Rachel looked up and smiled. "Good evening, Kyle," she said, looking him in the eyes. "I've been looking forward to being here." Kyle responded. Kyle stretched his arms wide, tilted his neck upwards, and was interrupted by his producer telling him and Rachel that it was time to start the show. Kyle shoved his producer out of the way, spread his arms wide, and began to scream loudly.
This is still
He
funny.
began to rotate slowly, screaming throughout, lightly brushing his hands against the faces of Rachel and his producer. After several minutes, Kyle was finished. He slowly put his hands to his sides and smiled. "I'm ready," said Kyle. Rachel blinked at Kyle, shrugged, and walked over to her seat. A moment after seating, the studio lights brightened the camera clicked on. "Good evening, everyone," said Kyle, looking at the camera. "Welcome back to Stay Up Late with Kyle. Tonight, I have the pleasure of interviewing the lovely Rachel May, who needs no more introduction."
Let's play some music.
As Rachel started to reply, Kyle clamped his hand over her mouth. "Hush," he said. "I need to do something before we continue." Kyle removed the CD he had brought to the interview and placed it in the nearby player deck. The sound system took action, piping Kyle's music throughout the studio. Rachel briefly listened, a blank expression on her face. Smiling, Kyle closed his eyes and enjoyed the music for a moment. Then he spoke. "All right, now everything's ready. Let's begin." Kyle produced the notes he had taken earlier. Hey, I ran over a puppy on purpose," said Kyle. I'm sorry, Kyle," said Rachel. "What on earth is this music? It's very... well, it's something."
Well, Kyle, I think
"It's an old favorite, Rachel," said Kyle. "This is what I grew up on. It's part of my most special collection." Kyle and Rachel sat silently, the music playing in the background. Rachel began to frown.
Oh my god.
Suddenly, the wall next to Kyle exploded. Through the hole stepped several men in dazzling, flamboyant costumes of bright color. They held guitars, pianos, and other instruments.
"Kyle,"
said the man in front.
"we are the band of your childhood."
Kyle's jaw dropped, smiling. He put his hands to his cheeks. His eyes sparkled.
"We have come to issue a grievance about playing our music on TV without a license."
The man took his guitar in both hands and began slamming Kyle's face repeatedly.
Wow, that's brutal.
After several hours, the grievance had been sufficiently repaid. The band left through the hole they had created in the wall. Kyle lay on the floor, thinking about what had happened. Rachel slowly slid to his side. Are you feeling okay, Kyle?" she asked. She had a concerned expression on her face. "Have you ever met your childhood idol, Rachel?" asked Kyle. "The person you looked up to for as long as you can remember?" "I can't say I have," said Rachel. Kyle raised both fists into the air.
It feels amazing!
Atlee asked Kyle is happy.
Kyle spent the rest of Rachel's interview chatting happily about meeting his lifelong favorite band. Rachel listened and asked questions politely, seeming unfazed that her moment on TV had been uprooted. Eventually, the studio was out of time and the broadcast shut off. Kyle and Rachel walked out of the studio together. Kyle was grinning widely. The two said their goodbyes and walked off in separate directions. As Kyle walked home, he felt like the interview had been everything he had hoped it to be. Kyle had gotten everything he had ever wanted as a child. Kyle quickly crouched down on the floor. Kyle started to pick. Soon, he had a small
Okay,
hand.
what is it we need
Kyle-
to do differently this time?
Kyle approached a middle-aged woman. Kyle unhinged his jaw and swallowed Gabby whole. Job done, Kyle returned to the middle of the street. Kyle asked the store attendant whether or not they offered any free samples to important customers. The attendant gave Kyle a confused and slightly vacant look. Kyle began to beg for a free sample. Wanting Kyle to leave, the attendant grabbed a decrepit phone meant for spare parts and held it out. Kyle took the phone placently from the outstretched hand and said quietly, "Thanks for your service." Kyle now has this phone to use forevermore. Kyle hurried to the set. Sitting across from his host chair was a glamorous woman with an air of genuinity. As Kyle approached her, Rachel looked up and smiled. "Good evening, Kyle," she said, looking him in the eyes. "I've been looking forward to being here." Kyle responded. Kyle's stretch was interrupted by his... Kyle shoved his producer out of the way, spread his arms wide, and began to scream loudly. He began to rotate slowly, screaming throughout, lightly brushing his hands against the faces of Rachel and his producer. After several minutes, Kyle was finished. He slowly put his hands to his sides and smiled. "I'm ready," said Kyle. Rachel blinked at Kyle, shrugged, and walked over to her seat. A moment after seating, the studio lights brightened and the cameras clicked on. "Good evening, everyone," said Kyle, looking at the camera. "Welcome back to Stay Up Late with Kyle." Kyle vomited all of the horrible things he had eaten earlier onto the floor. Rachel looked at Kyle, concerned, gave a couple coughs, and decided to play it cool and keep the show running. Kyle stopped, then vomited again, then continued with a shaky voice. "Tonight, I have the pleasure of interviewing the lovely Rachel May, who needs no more introduction."
I actually haven't seen that option, I don't think.
"However," said Kyle, suddenly dropping his voice, "Rachel May is not sitting next to me. She is not new to this show. She did not walk in before me. In fact," said Kyle, "I am Rachel May." Rachel looked at Kyle, confused, and silently mouthed the words, "You are who?" Kyle stood up quickly and threw his arm high above him, pointing upwards. "I have never been Kyle," he proclaimed. "I have never been the host of the show Stay Up Late with Kyle." Kyle looked and pointed directly at the camera. "I am here for but one reason, to interview myself."
Huh? What is this?
Kyle sat down in his chair and went to produce the notes he had taken earlier. Kyle read the first question on his list. "Is your mother a mother?" Kyle replied, "No, because I am my mother." And, continued Kyle, I am your mother and everyone's mother, and also Rachel and Kyle, and I'm also your children and that woman you met in the coffee shop yesterday, and your high school best friend. And I'm your friends, and I'm that person next to you, and I'm also you! Kyle waved his arms around and smiled. Nobody seemed to understand. It's a magic trick! Shouted Kyle happily. I'm everyone now!
I'm so lost.
Kyle got up and happily danced out of the studio, arms spread wide. Although not taken seriously at first, sociologists quickly found that Kyle's claims were true. Somehow, magically, Kyle became everyone and nobody else technically existed anymore. After a massive amount of study, it was found that Kyle had stumbled upon a very unexpected sociological loophole. Nobody really knew what to do with this newfound discovery, so they decided to do nothing. Kyle continued to be theoretically everyone, and everybody else continued to be theoretically non-existent. It was a strange time to be alive. Kyle quickly crouched down on the... Kyle...
All right, let's get this ending real quick.
Kyle hurried to the set. Sitting across from his host chair was a glamorous woman with an air of genuinity. As Kyle approached her, Rachel looked up and smiled. Rachel's smile quickly turned to shock as she realized Kyle had not put on clothes that day. Kyle waved and smiled broadly. Rachel uncomfortably averted her eyes. Kyle started making his rounds around the room, greeting each crew member, none of whom looked at him directly. As it became apparent that Kyle had no intention of leaving, Rachel made some excuses and exited the set. One by one, the crew followed suit. Kyle was left all alone.
All right, might need to censor that word, but all right. Anyways, that's the end of today's episode. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.
Vai, toma, toma, vai, toma, toma, vai, toma, toma.